Chapter 4 Beatlemania. In December 1960, the Beatles were back in England. There were only 4 of them now, because Stuart Sutcliffe stayed in Hamburg. Nobody in Liverpool remembered the band. But when they began to play at a concert there one night, everyone became very excited. They moved nearer to the front, and some people began to scream. The Beatles' music was different now, after Hamburg. It was not skiffle or rock and roll. It was something new and exciting, and people loved it. Everyone began to talk about the Beatles. In April 1961, John, Paul, George and Pete played most nights in clubs all around Liverpool, and the clubs sold every ticket. That spring, the Beatles went back to Hamburg for 4 months, and they recorded songs there with a singer called Tony Sheridan. Then, in November, they played in a Liverpool club called the Cavern Club. It was not a big club, and it was hot, dark, smoky, and noisy. But some of the best bands in Liverpool and in Britain played there. A young man called Brian Epstein saw the Beatles at the Cavern Club. Epstein did not often listen to bands, and he was not a band manager before he met John, Paul, George and Pete. He had a record shop, but he knew a lot about music, and he loved the Beatles. He came back and watched the band many times in the next few weeks. The Beatles liked him, and he soon became their manager. Epstein quickly changed the Beatles' hair and clothes. They wore suits now, so they looked different from most bands, and people remembered them. Epstein looked for a record company for the Beatles too. Bands become famous because record companies make and sell their records. So this was important for the Beatles. But for a long time, no record companies were interested. Then someone from Decca Records saw the band and liked them. So the Beatles performed for the record company on New Year's Day, 1962. But they did not play well that day, and Decca did not want to make their records. In August 1962, Ringo Starr became the Beatles' new drummer, and Pete Best left the band. John married his girlfriend Cynthia Powell that month too. But he did not see his new wife very much. The Beatles had concerts every night. That summer, they began to play at the Cavern Club all the time. Slowly, more people became interested in Liverpool music. TV and magazine reporters from Europe and the USA visited the club, and they began to talk about Liverpool music, or live-a-pop. After a lot of work, Brian Epstein now had a record company for the Beatles. Parlophone, EMI, began to record their songs. In October 1962, the Beatles' first record, the song Love Me Do was number 17 in the British music charts. It was an exciting time for the band. In February 1963, the Beatles had their first number one hit with a John Lennon song, Please Please Me. Later, there was an album called Please Please Me too, and the Beatles recorded all 14 songs in one day. John Lennon was ill that day, and the band played for 10 hours, but he sang amazingly. 3 more of the Beatles' songs were number one in 1963. The band became famous because of their records, and it happened very fast. In October, they came to London and were on TV. 15 million people watched them on TV, and thousands of fans waited outside the TV studio. People screamed and stopped cars in the street. One reporter called it Beatlemania. People cried and screamed at every Beatles concert. Fans waited outside their hotels too, sometimes all night in the cold and rain. In the Beatles' first film, A Hard Day's Night, John, Paul, George and Ringo run away from their fans. In Britain, that was their life. People loved the Beatles because their songs were great, and you could easily remember and sing them. The Beatles were young, like their fans, and they looked good too. But the Beatles became famous because they worked very hard. They played or recorded 7 days a week, and John and Paul wrote new songs at night in their hotel rooms. Between 1960 and 1964, the Beatles performed for about 1,200 hours. Most bands do not play that much in their lives. In November 1964, the Beatles did a big concert in Liverpool. Thousands of fans were in the streets, and more people stood in windows and on roofs. "We want the Beatles!" people cried, and the noise was amazing. These 4 young men from Liverpool were now Britain's most famous faces. Chapter 5. World Famous. In the autumn of 1963, a famous American magazine laughed at British Beatles fans for their crying and screaming. But soon, Beatlemania arrived in the USA. In February 1964, the Beatles song I Want to Hold Your Hand was number one in the American charts. That month, when the Beatles went to the USA, 5,000 fans waited for their plane at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. On the 9th of February, 73 million people watched the Beatles on the famous Ed Sullivan Show on American TV. In the New York studio, people screamed when the Beatles began to play. Outside, thousands of fans stood on Broadway and 53rd Street. No one could get through the streets. American stars like Elvis Presley were famous in Britain. Now, suddenly, Americans loved a British band. Later, British bands and singers like the Rolling Stones and Elton John became famous in the USA too. But it all began with the Beatles, that night in New York City. The Beatles played 2 concerts on their first visit to the USA, in Washington, D.C. and New York City. But they came back again in August 1964 for a 1-month, 30-concert tour of Canada and the USA. On the 23rd of August 1964, the Beatles performed at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. After the concert, they met some of Hollywood's rich and famous. When John was a boy, he watched these film stars in the Walton Cinema with his cousins. Now, they wanted to meet him. In the next 2 years, the Beatles went on tours to many countries. And there was Beatlemania around the world. People nearly died in crowds in the Philippines. In New Zealand, hundreds of fans stopped the Beatles' car, and they could not get out. In Tokyo, the band could not leave their hotel because there were thousands of fans outside. So, John, Paul, George and Ringo sat in their hotel room and made a picture. Years later, somebody bought it for $155,000. On their third American tour in 1965, the Beatles visited Elvis at his house in Los Angeles. They sat and talked about music. Then they began to play guitar with him. It was amazing for John because Elvis was his hero. Friends watched while the 2 greatest names in music, the Beatles and Elvis, played together. When the Beatles were not on tour, they recorded music in London. Between 1963 and 1965, they made 6 albums. And lots of their songs, like Can't Buy Me Love, A Ticket to Ride, and We Can Work It Out, were number 1 in Britain and the USA. Thousands of people bought the records, and fans could buy Beatles t-shirts, guitars, magazines, and lots more things too. The Beatles became very rich, and John Lennon bought a big house and a very expensive car. The money was great, but some things were not easy. The Beatles could not go out for dinner or go to the shops because fans ran after them, and they quickly became tired of this. And they were not happy with their concerts because people screamed and nobody could hear their music. Some of John and Paul's songs at this time, like Help, were not happy ones. Because people loved the Beatles, they watched them on TV and read about them in magazines all the time. But sometimes the Beatles did not think carefully before they spoke. In July 1966, John said something to a magazine reporter, and American fans became very angry when they read about it. On the Beatles' fourth tour of the USA, people broke Beatles records in the street and protested outside the concerts. Some people wrote angry letters too. "You're going to die," some of them said. And Brian Epstein was afraid. Is somebody going to shoot John Lennon? He thought. Chapter 6. Family Man. In April 1964, a man walked into Brian Epstein's office and said, "I'm John Lennon's father." When John saw Alf Lennon, he was not happy. He thought, "Do I want to meet my father again after 19 years? Why did he go away all those years ago? Why did he not visit or write?" John could not forget these things. He met his father sometimes after that, but they never became good friends. John's family life was not easy. He and Cynthia had a son now, called Julian. John wanted to be a good father to Julian, but he did not have much time with his family. The Beatles were always on tour, or at the recording studios in London. So Cynthia and Julian often did not see John for weeks. And when he was at home, he worked very hard. He wrote songs all the time. And he wrote 2 books too. In the winter of 1966, John met a Japanese artist called Yoko Ono in London. They soon became very good friends. Yoko was 7 years older than John, but she was very like him. She was an artist and musician too. And, like John, Yoko had a young child, a daughter, called Kyoko. John and Cynthia soon broke up. And after that, he was with Yoko all the time. They made art together, and Yoko came to the studio when the Beatles recorded their music. On the 20th of March, 1969, Yoko and John got married in Gibraltar. Yoko Ono became Yoko Ono Lennon, and John later changed his name to John Ono Lennon. That summer, they bought a beautiful house called Tittenhurst Park. Everything in the rooms was white, and they had a beautiful garden and a recording studio. Yoko and John were happy there, and they recorded some amazing songs in the studio. Julian often came to the house, and he played with Kyoko. John and Yoko loved to do things with the children. One year, they all went on holiday to Scotland, because John remembered happy summers there with his cousins. Chapter 7. Going Solo. On the 29th of August, 1966, the Beatles performed at Candlestick Park, San Francisco. 25,000 fans listened to the Beatles that cold summer evening. But it was the band's last big concert. The Beatles did not need to do concerts and tours now. They could work in a studio and sell millions of records. They were afraid of the crowds at concerts too. Some fans got too excited. A year after the San Francisco concert, Brian Epstein died. He was only 32 years old. Epstein was an amazing manager and a great friend too. It was very hard for the Beatles because they were musicians, not managers. They did not manage the band well after Epstein died. They began a company called Apple, but the company lost a lot of money, and things were not easy between John, Paul, George, and Ringo. On a cold winter's day in January 1969, the Beatles played together for the last time. They performed for a film on a roof in London. People stood in the street and listened. Office workers looked out of windows. Taxi drivers stopped their cars. They could not see the people on the roof, but everybody knew their songs. In the end, the police came onto the roof and stopped them because of the noise. A year later, the band began to break up. Many of their fans could not understand it. But the Beatles all wanted to do different things now, and they wanted to write different music. In 1970, all four Beatles made solo albums. After that, the four of them never played together again. John Lennon made 8 solo albums, most of them in the USA. When John wrote songs for the Beatles, they were usually about love. But the songs on his solo albums were often about the world around him or about his life. Some of them are very sad. His second album, called Imagine, became one of the most important albums of all time. 1971 was an important year for John and Yoko. They moved to the USA. They found a house in Greenwich Village in Manhattan, and they were very happy there. New York in the 1970s was the most exciting city in the world. John and Yoko's door was always open, and they met lots of interesting people. They knew many of the best artists, writers, and musicians of their time. John and Yoko went around the city on bicycles, and John loved his life there.